This is the first set of notes for Unit 1. Let me just tell you a few things about taking notes. When you take notes in this class, you're taking your own notes. You don't need to copy down every word on the screen. If there are important things that you need to write down from what's written on the screen when there are words, I'll try to point those out and highlight them for you. If you're taking notes in class, that's what you'll do. If you're taking in course of class, you can always ask a question. If you're taking notes at home using a video, then you can always pause the video as needed to write something down or to write down a thought, or you can go back and rewind if you need to. So let's talk about the properties of life. So this is the first science course that you've taken that's about one single topic, and that is life science. Okay, biology is by definition the scientific study of life. The word biology comes from two Greek roots. Bio means life, bios means life, and the ology part comes from a word that means studying or learning about. Okay, so this is the scientific study of life. But it's not always easy to define what life is. I mean, we can recognize what we think are living things, but then there are some things that are a little bit more difficult to determine. And so biologists or scientists have come up with a list of properties that most biologists agree define life and define what's living, and that includes an orderly structure, reproduction, growth and development, energy processing, response to the environment, regulation, and evolutionary adaptation. We're going to talk about each one of these in turn, so don't think you have to hurry to write stuff down right now, because we're going to talk about each one of these separately. Another big thing to realize about living things is that all living things are made of cells. We'll talk later on about something called the cell theory, and that states the cell is the structural and functional unit of life. And so all of these things, part of the orderly structure is that all living things are made of cells. Okay, so order. We're talking about an orderly structure. Sometimes it has to do with the cells, the fact that all living things are made of cells. Sometimes if you look at this plant here, you can see repeating patterns of the leaflets around the center of the plant. And so all of those things go into ordered structure. Okay, when you're building something, like when you were a little kid and you were first building with blocks, you probably try to stack all the blocks on top of each other, see how tall you get. And once your stack of blocks gets to a certain height, it's going to be unstable, it's going to fall over. And so as you learned more about building blocks, you learned that you needed to have more blocks on the bottom and fewer blocks as you moved upward. That way you could build a taller and more stable tower. And so basically when we talk about order, we're talking about not only the cells, the building blocks of life, of course, we're talking about the way they're put together. When you've seen lots of houses being built, of course, and the first thing you start with is the foundation and then the frame before you start putting the walls and the windows and the ceiling, the roof and the ceiling and so forth. And so you have to have some structure to start with, and so ordered structure is part of that. Well, of course, when we're talking about some living things, we're talking about just single cells. But even within the cell, there's certain orderly structure. You know a little bit about organelles in cells. You know that cells have nuclei. Eukaryotic cells have nuclei, and the nuclei contain the chromosomes. And you know that there are other organelles that do certain different jobs in the cell. And so that's part of the orderly structure as well. And then, of course, when you look at larger organisms like people, like other animals, okay, you see that there's structure at various levels within that organism. So orderly structure is a very important component that living things have. Are non-living things sometimes organized? Sure, but this is something, they're not organized in the same way that living things are. All right. Another property that all living things share is reproduction. Not just reproduction, but reproduction after your own kind. That means that when this elephant has a baby, it's going to be a baby elephant, not a baby rhinoceros. Okay, so they're producing offspring that look like them, that belong to the same species that they belong to. Now, when you talk about the simplest organisms, like single-celled organisms or bacteria or things like that, they reproduce after their own kind by basic simple cell division, mitosis, okay? And they produce a series of offspring that are basically like clones of the original, because all they do is replicate the internal structure, and then they divide in half. It's a little bit more complicated. We'll learn about that later on, but that's one type of reproduction. Okay. We have plants that reproduce. Some plants reproduce sexually by means of flowers and other structures like that. Others, like this one, reproduce asexually. Each one of these little ruffle things on the edges of the leaf are baby plantlets that can fall off and grow into a whole plant. And again, they're like clones of the original plant. Of course, animals generally undergo sexual reproduction. And so like the seahorse here, or like the birds, they're again going to produce offspring that look like themselves. The offspring are going to end up being the same species that the parent belongs to. Growth and development has to occur after reproduction occurs. So all organisms grow and develop, whether they're growing from a baby crocodile that looks like an adult crocodile, except a whole lot smaller, also a whole lot less ferocious. They're going to develop more as they grow. So not only is this alligator going to grow, or crocodile going to grow, it's going to grow more powerful, and not only larger, but more powerful, and be a formidable predator of lots of different things. Of course, you can think about human growth as well, from babyhood to toddlerhood to young childhood to adolescence. Okay, so not only are you growing in size, you're growing in intellectual capability, in coordination and ability to perform different tasks. So that's part of your development process as well. Plants also do the same thing. Not only are they going to grow bigger, but they're going to develop other organs that can be used for the plant's feeding itself, for the reproduction. All of those different things are going to develop from the basic plant itself as it grows. And then, of course, when you think about animal growth and development, you think about starting with that single cell that was the union of your father's sperm and your mother's egg cell. And as it goes from a single cell to a multiple cell stage, and eventually starts to develop into different tissues and organs as you develop. And so you can see the development, not only the growth again in size, but also the development. And you can think about this in terms of entire organisms, from the DNA at the beginning, which then starts to, as the cell is starting to grow, the ribosomes are going to start making proteins so that the cell can produce all the materials it needs to grow further. The cell's going to grow and divide and to make the embryo, which will eventually develop into a fetus and be born as a baby, which will then grow and produce a more mature organism at the end. Another property that living things share is response to the environment. I really like this picture of the Venus flytrap with the fly caught in it, okay? And I always get asked the question when we talk about Venus flytraps in class, is a Venus flytrap a plant or an animal? Well, it is a plant. It does undergo photosynthesis. It doesn't depend entirely upon the fly for its nutrition, but where Venus flytraps live is an area that has very poor soil, and they don't have access to all of the nutrients they need to make all the proteins and nucleic acids in order to grow and reproduce. And so the Venus flytrap, and there are other carnivorous plants as well, have evolved a method of trapping and digesting small animals like flies and other small animals to get the nitrogen and phosphorus that they need that they can't get from their environment. And so responding to the environment in this case would be the fly landing on the leaf of the Venus flytrap, and then triggering the guard hairs that are there, and that causes the leaf to close to trap the fly. Okay. Another kind of response you might think about is something called phototropism. You know, if you have a plant that's growing and it only has light coming from one direction, eventually the plant's going to start bending toward the light. All right, that is a type of response as well. Other responses would be like conditioned responses that you develop in terms of, this is called the Pavlovian response, whereas the dog is hungry and salivates when it sees the food ready to eat. If you always ring a bell every time you feed the dog, then eventually when it hears the bell ring, it's going to start salivating, thinking that food's on its way. You also have responses to your internal environment. This it shows a couple of hormones that respond to the increase in your blood sugar or the decrease in your blood sugar to help make sure that you can maintain a stable level, and that's responding to the conditions in your inside environment. The next property is energy processing, okay? And you might wonder why we're showing a caterpillar munching on a stem. Well, energy processing involves food, okay, feeding yourself. And so you might think about eating as being providing the energy for various things, and that's what it does. But where does that energy ultimately come from? Of course, all energy on Earth originally comes from the sun. Okay, and so you have here the process of photosynthesis, where your energy is being transferred, the solar energy is being transformed into food for the plant, which we can also eat, as you see with the caterpillar here. Okay, that's a type of energy processing. You're converting the energy into matter, or using the energy from the sun to make matter in a form that can be consumed and release energy within the cells. Okay, you can think about it a little bit bigger scale when you look at a food chain or a food web, where you can see the energy coming from the sun for photosynthesis, which is then consumed by the rabbit, which can undergo cellular respiration to release carbon dioxide and water vapor and make ATP, which is the main energy molecule that we use. You can go a little bit more in depth and see what happens inside cells, where you have organelles in the plant cell called chloroplasts that undergo photosynthesis to provide the storage form of that solar energy. And inside the mitochondrion, where that storage form, glucose, can be converted into the energy that your cells can use, which is called ATP. And then on a larger scale, of course, you can look at the whole food web and see how that energy is being passed from one level in the ecosystem to another. And we can use the energy to convert matter into forms that we can consume and produce energy in our cells. So energy processing is something that must be present in living things. Another process present in living things is regulation. And you might think it's kind of strange to see a picture of a lizard on a rock as regulation. But what the lizard is doing here is it's regulating its body temperature. We are mammals, and there are other mammals and birds mostly, are able to produce our body heat, regulate our body heat by internal processes. But reptiles and amphibians can't do that. They have to use their behavior to moderate their body temperature. And so when lizards and other reptiles get cold, they move into the sun and sit in the sun to absorb energy and raise their body temperature. When they get too hot, their behavior tells them to move into the shade or into a burrow to cool off. And so regulation is an important process that living things have to be able to do in order to maintain their processes. Another kind of regulation would be regulating the presence of or how enzymes and hormones affect the various processes in your body. This particular diagram is showing you a couple of different hormones that help regulate your water balance in your body, and whether you need to retain water or excrete more water depending on the conditions that you're in and the presence of water in your body. Another type of regulation would be in the process of plants. We talked about a while ago phototropism in plants. The way that happens is actually the plant is regulating its growth, making it grow in a certain direction. There are hormones that are produced by the plant that have a tendency to collect on the shady side of the plant, and those hormones stimulate growth of those cells. As the cells get longer on that side, but not on the sunny side, the plant starts to bend toward the light over time, and that is the way the plant regulates getting enough light for its processes. And the last process that all living things share is evolutionary adaptation. Why in the world do we show the picture of the red panda here? The red panda is, of course, the theme animal of your textbook. And they live mostly in China and areas like that in the mountains. They eat largely bamboo, and they live in relatively snowy areas a lot of the time. Okay, you might think that panda doesn't look like it's well adapted to live in the snow because it's got red fur, but that red fur helps it blend in with the trees that it lives in. Okay, it also has a very thick bushy tail that it can wrap around itself to add body warmth. So it's very well adapted for its area. Not only that, in the wrist of the red panda's forelimb, there's a special wrist bone that is adapted to allow them to grasp onto the bamboo that they eat. It's not really a thumb, it's called a false thumb, but it does help them grasp the bamboo that they couldn't do otherwise because they do not have opposable thumbs like you and I do. You think about adaptation as in this rabbit here, which during the spring and summer is darker in color and kind of blends in with the landscape that it lives in, but in the wintertime when it gets snowy, then the rabbit's color changes to a lighter color, more of a white color, so that it blends in with the snow and can hide from its predators. We oftentimes think about camouflage type things as types of adaptations. Here's another one. Here's a lizard that is very much blends in with the coloration of its environment. But you'll also notice that this lizard is sitting on a really thin vine here. It's awfully big for that. If the descendants of this, if this lizard happened to live in an environment where all it had was really thin vines to climb on, over time you would see that its offspring, that its descendants would develop into lizards that had shorter legs and shorter toes so that they could more easily climb on those thin vines than on bigger things that they had available. And then lastly we have the classic bird beaks, okay, when you have an ancestor with a medium-sized beak, and if it goes into an area where not a whole lot lives, its offspring over time will develop into different groups that have different shaped beaks that eat different things that can take advantage of the environment that they live in. And so those are our 7 characteristics or properties that all living things share. Now, we also have coevolution of like pollinators and flowers, for instance. They can adapt to each other over time so that some flowers can only be pollinated by certain insects, and that's an important process in the development, in the evolution of the flower and of the insect. So, how would you define life? What I want you to do is stop for a minute, and I want you to identify the properties of life that are exhibited by the picture on the next slide. Now I'm going to show you a picture, and I want you to stop and think for a minute, and I want you to make a list of all of the properties that are exhibited by this picture on the next slide to determine whether this is living or not living. All right, here's the picture. You ready? This is what the exterior of this entity looks like. Here's a cross section to show you the interior part of it. And so pause for a minute and write down all the characteristics that can be exhibited by this particular entity to determine whether it is living or whether it is not. I hope you said that it was not living, because that is actually the novel coronavirus, the SARS-CoV-2, that causes the disease that we've been dealing with this year, which is COVID-19. Another thing that you can do with living things is, as humans, we have a tendency to want to organize things. And so biologists arrange the diversity of life into 3 basic groups, 3 big groups. Okay, we have domain bacteria, which is composed of bacteria like strep and staph and things like that you're used to talking about or hearing about. Domain archaea, which is also composed of prokaryotes, but these are ones that live in very extreme environments. You don't really come in contact with them very much. And then the third domain of life is the domain eukarya, which includes all things that are eukaryotic cells, meaning cells that have nuclei and other organelles. And this includes the protista, which has multiple kingdoms, lots of diversity in that particular group of organisms, the plants, the fungi, and of course the animals. We'll talk more about classification later on. Stop for a minute, answer this question: to which of the 3 domains do we belong? What particular domain do humans belong to? Hopefully you answered domain eukarya. in the organization of life, okay, another big thing to realize is that as we move from a more simple level to a more complex level, there are properties that arise from that. Those are called emergent properties. They result from the specific arrangement and interaction of component parts of various living things. And so when we look at an ecosystem like this, okay, we have the biosphere, of course, which is all of Earth. Within biosphere, we have multiple ecosystems that include not only the living things that live there, but also the non-living parts like water and the rocks. In each ecosystem, we have a number of different communities. A community is all of the different living organisms in an ecosystem that interact with each other. Communities are made up of populations of organisms of the same species. And then an individual or an organism would be one of that population. Within that organism, we have organs and organ systems that are composed of tissues, which are composed of cells, which contain organelles like the nucleus, and the organelles and components of the cell are made up of molecules. As we move from a simpler level to a more complex one, there are properties that are exhibited there that you don't have unless you have the whole organism. The tissue has all the same kind of cells, but they can work together to do a more important job. And multiple tissues can make up organs that can perform even more jobs inside the organism. The organism as a whole is composed of all of those different organs and organ systems. And as a member of the population, if you've ever seen videos of fish swimming in schools and how they can all turn together, you can see that that's a property that school would have that wouldn't be necessarily in the single organism. Last question, which of these levels of organization includes all of the others in the list? The cell, the molecule, the organ, or the tissue? So think about that for a minute, write that down in your notes, and this ends this particular set of notes on the properties of living things.